again, this is so frustrating to go through this because each one of these subjects is elegantly illuminates the skill of the designer. You can take something as trivial as a bird's feather, and you could spend a whole evening on discovering how skillfully that's designed. And to attribute that to happenstance or accident is nonsense. But we won't get into all that here. The real death of Darwinism comes from lots of reasons, but not the least of which is microbiology. Advances in microbiology, namely the DNA and all that, have dealt the death blow. They put the final nails in Darwin's coffin in a sense. Because the DNA that we now discover is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. And we have time to develop that, but it's just utterly absurd to attribute the elegance of that code to random chance. And when you design a computer, you've got to have the language and the machinery processing that language intimately coordinated. To ascribe either one, or certainly together, as randomness is absolute folly in logic. And Darwinism cannot explain the origin of life because it cannot explain the origin of information. And there's another concept that's emerging called irreducible complexity. We're indebted to Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, where he illustrates this idea with a simple mousetrap. Here we have a mousetrap that has 5 parts. It has a basic platform on which there's a hammer. That hammer is driven by a spring. It's held back by a holding bar that's tucked under a catch. All of us are familiar with a mousetrap. And what's interesting, there are 5 parts here. Trying to make this simpler is pretty futile. These 5 parts have to be there in some function or another. It's interesting that if you have only 4 of the 5 parts, you don't catch 4/5 as many mice, you catch 0. The point is there's a concept in design called irreducible complexity. It can't get simpler than this. That indicates it's designed. It can't happen by accident. And let's take a single-celled creature called a bacteria. It has a flagellum, a little tail that propels it through its fluid. And if you look at this carefully, we're not going to get into all the other details. This is a single-celled animal, and we're going to just look at where the flagellum is connected to the creature. And we discover there are 40 parts to an electric motor. It doesn't wiggle, it spins. And it is an elegantly designed motor with 40 critical parts, any one of which missing, it doesn't work. So this did not happen by chance. It evidences design, highly skillful design. And so we won't get here into all that detail. But then we get, of course, to the next day. We have animals, and the 6th day we have animals, mammals, and, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Man, created in day 6. And so I won't spend a lot of time on this. Most of us are victims of this nonsense promoted by our textbooks, and even in National Geographic and Scientific American publish these crazy things, that we came from monkeys and that nonsense. When you get into this and study it with any depth at all, you'll discover something astonishing. Not only is this nonsense, it's deliberate fraud. The Heidelberg man was contrived from a single jawbone. The Nebraska man in 1922, Henry Osborne, did it from just 1 tooth, and they later discovered it was from an extinct pig. The Piltdown man you hear so much about. Charles Dawson developed this from the jawbone of a modern ape. It was deliberate fraud. We now know it was filed and treated with iron salts to look old. If you get to the Peking man in 1921, the evidence has disappeared, but it also bears evidence of an outright fraud. These are not people who made a discovery and were just misguided. These are people who deliberately contrived these things to be misleading. The Neanderthal man, found in a cave in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf. At the International Congress of Zoology in 1958, they concluded that it was just simply an old man suffering from arthritis. The Java man, 1922, in 1891, skull cap, a 50-foot femur thigh bone that was not even near it, was distant from it, and the evidence was concealed. It was teeth of an orangutan. The thing that disturbs you about paleontology is that it's littered with deliberate frauds, not just poor science, but deliberate frauds. So all this is you'll still find in the textbooks used in your schools to mislead our kids. In 120 years of searching, there have been no intermediate stages found to justify evolution. We could go on and on, but let's move on here. We get to day 7, the 7th rest, the 7th day rest. And you notice there's no Erev and Boker. There's no discrete steps. God had finished his creation. It's completed. That's the whole theme of day 7. And there's no Erev on Boker. For instance, now our problem in these so-called day, how old is the universe in the days, it's clear that God intended us to understand that. And our problem is not Genesis 1. People talk about the word yom and what it might mean. That's silliness. It's Exodus 20, verse 11, where the creator of the universe with his own finger wrote it in stone. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that in them is. And he rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. And incidentally, he didn't do that in Exodus 20. He did that in Genesis 1. And so our problem isn't in grasping the 6-day thing. It's clear God intended us to understand that he did it in 6 days. And in days as we think of them. I won't quibble about 24-hour business, but clearly it's a day-by-day thing. And the real mystery to those that really understand who God is why did he take 6 days? But in any case, that's what he chose to do, and he did. The field of thermodynamics has been really solidified in 125 years. It's been fully described. And the first law of thermodynamics is called the conservation of matter and energy. It asserts that matter and energy, they're equivalent to each other, can neither be created nor destroyed under natural circumstances. And nowhere in the universe is matter being created or annihilated. All observed processes in the universe conserve matter or its equivalent energy. And the corollary to this is natural processes cannot create energy. All of this is a result of a creation of the past. That's the implication of the first law. And you can also say there's no way to win. In other words, matter and energy you can't create either one of them. And it's interesting, that's exactly what the scripture says in Genesis 2. In the seventh day, God ended his work. And that's a thermodynamic statement. The works were finished from the foundation of the world in the book of Hebrews and so forth. All things that were therein, you preserve them all. Nehemiah 9:6, and it's all through the scripture. Well, there's a second law of thermodynamics, and that's what we call the entropy laws. The second law, the bondage of decay. First law says there's no way to win. The second one says you can't even break even. What it really means is there's an arrow of time. It asserts that as time advances, the universe progresses from a state of order to a state of disorder. And we find that in our closets and